The obvious example being the reports that the Russians are supporting the Houthis with targeting data, or have been supporting the Houthis in targeting data, and contemplated exporting the P-800, a supersonic anti-ship missile, to the Houthis. Our approach to ASW just doesn't scale. For any single contact, one requires multiple assets to track it, including maritime patrol aircraft, frigates, and SSNs. And that just about works if you're tracking single contacts in in terms of peacetime competition. Once one is dealing with multiple contacts surging into a theater, the approach doesn't scale. In the Indo-Pacific, China will pose America a naval challenge of a kind it really hasn't faced in its 20th century history, namely that of a peer competitor which not just matches it, but actually exceeds it in terms of many areas like, shipbuilding capacity. For example, the tempo of activity we've seen in the Red Sea would have quickly exhausted our stockpiles. The US Navy fired, I think, 80 Tomahawks in the early days of the conflict with the Houthis. I mean, in 2014, we bought 65 Tomahawk.
Very well, welcome to this latest edition of In Defence, a look at the various aspects of defence and how the UK government particularly is going to have to wrestle with some difficult choices. I'm delighted to welcome Dr Sidharth Kaushal today, who's the Senior Research Fellow for the Maritime, for Sea Power with RUSI, with a particular focus on the role of maritime power in state grand strategy. I don't think there's a better person to help us navigate through some of the challenges in this space. A very warm welcome to you, Sidharth.
Thank you for having me.
I think if we could just start off with a really high-level question. I mean, the UK has traditionally been a maritime nation, but it feels like for the last 35 years, we've been doing more expeditionary warfare, and we've configured all of our armed forces around that. And that seems to be what we've ended up with our Royal Navy as well. Do you think there's a significant change in role, given that we're looking now probably wars of national survival? And where do you think in big handfuls the Royal Navy is going to play a part in that in the future?
It's a really interesting question. And I think you're absolutely right. We're in some ways reconfiguring from that era of expeditionary warfare towards a much more NATO first approach across the services. And I think what that means in the maritime domain, into as far as priorities go, is a couple of things. The first, of course, is the old challenge of anti-submarine warfare, which is not necessarily, novel. The Russian submarine threat is something we've confronted in some form through pretty much the entirety of the Cold War. But I think that the navies of the alliance will have to operate in a slightly different way against the Russian submarine threat as it's emerging now. Because increasingly the Russians do not feel the numbers of boats that, for example, the Soviet Navy did. But we're looking at increasingly quiet boats, many of which can pose a long-range precision strike threat from relative proximity to Russia's bastions. And what that implies for ASW, I think, is a much more forward-leaning ASW approach, closer to areas like the Bear Islands Svalbard Gap than the traditional GI-UK gap. That in turn obviously implies a certain degree of risk from all of the other assets under the Northern Fleet Joint Strategic Command, whether that's, aircraft like the backfire bombers or a limited number of surface vessels with still quite potent missile capabilities. So the ability to man that northern flank, I think, is going to be a key question for the navies of Northern Europe, and I think the Royal Navy in particular. The second question, I think, that will have to be confronted is, to what extent should maritime power be seen as a sort of an asymmetrical offset in Europe? So are there ways in which Russian capabilities and resources can be stretched in directions that are inefficient, particularly because, as the Arctic and the Northern Sea route become ever more important to Russia, the ability to do ASW over this pretty vast expanse is something that could potentially impose real costs on them. But of course, that also implies a acceptance of a certain amount of political risk, because of course the bastion is the bastion because Russia's SSBNs operate there. And B, it raises some significant questions regarding availability of capabilities, like SSNs, where the availability of astute has been a serious consideration. So I think those are the two big questions that the navies of Europe and the Royal Navy in particular will find themselves confronting in Europe. Having said that, there is also a question about the balance of risk, because even though we talk about, post-expeditionary warfare and a NATO first focus, it should be said that, the Cold War was not fought in the Fulda Gap or anywhere in Europe, was it? Its hottest elements were in places like Vietnam or Korea. And it's entirely possible that a new Cold War with Russia could pan out exactly the same way. The obvious example being the reports that the Russians are supporting the Houthis with targeting data, or have been supporting the Houthis in targeting data, and contemplated exporting the P-800, a supersonic anti-ship missile, to the Houthis. And so there is a risk of opting for a sort of a modern version of the Not review, for a force that's optimized for a single function, which actually gets thrown off kilter if what one finds is that the strategic diagnosis that we're in for a long period of competition with Russia is correct, but the competition manifests elsewhere in the world at expeditionary reach. So I don't think we can ever get rid of that expeditionary focus, even if priorities are rebalanced slightly towards a Europe-centric optimization.
There's a couple of things I'd like to just pursue there, little threads that you've dropped out. One of which is when I was in the MOD not that long ago, there were two driving threats. One of them was Russia, the other was China. Your focus there on the response was more around Russia, which in a way surprised me, because there is a view that they've been badly mauled as a result of their experience in Ukraine, and their focus will probably be less on maritime and more on rebuilding land. I guess the second one as well is that if, therefore, one of the main roles of the Royal Navy into the future is the anti-submarine warfare role, it feels like that's a bit of a return to a capability which we possibly have let go a little bit. And actually, are we equipped today? I'm thinking particularly the carriers used to be purely enabling protection of the fleet in that role, whereas we've currently got two of the biggest carriers in the world that were configured for power projection, not for anti-submarine warfare. I know it's a long question, but two, is China the other driving threat, and in which case has the Royal Navy got a role there, or is that America's responsibility? And secondly, how on earth do we respond and get back to being good at anti-submarine warfare, which we were very good at?
Yeah, no, I think that's a really interesting set of questions. So perhaps beginning with the question of, is Russia going to spend more time reconstituting its ground forces than investing in the maritime domain? I think it certainly will have to reconstitute its ground forces. But what I think one of the consequences of the war will be for Russia is the structural militarization, at least partially, of the Russian economy. Because, in addition to just being a means of getting through this war, really, what this conflict has, what investment in a larger military has done within Russia politically is it's served almost as a wealth transfer mechanism to constituencies which the Russian state needs to stay in power, mostly, poorer, formerly industrial constituencies in post-Soviet Russia, which are actually wellsprings of support for the Russian state. So politically, I don't think they can afford to turn those taps off. There's also an ongoing conversation within Russia about the risk of a so-called fragile middle class, people who've moved from the working class upwards purely because of massive bonuses paid to people mobilized for the front, and what happens if those people essentially bounce back down into the working class. So again, there's a significant sort of incentive to continue with very high levels of defense spending. But the third point I'd make is, as a percentage of GDP, they aren't really approximating this, for example, the former Soviet Union, which was spending, depending on who you ask, anywhere between 15 and 25% of GDP, which really crushed their economy. We're looking very much at the 5 to 7% of GDP mark. So this is arguably a sustainable level of military spending for them, particularly because when this conflict ends, however it ends, operating costs get cut out of their spending and presumably can be allocated to investment. I suppose the second question is, does that spending go to the army or the navy? And I think to some extent they cannot afford to ignore the navy for a few reasons. The first is that the idea of being a globally engaged power is quite central to both their vision of themselves in the world, but also to some of their broader economic plans. For example, the notion of being a key exporter of hydrocarbons in the Indo-Pacific, or a key exporter of agricultural goods in North Africa and the Middle East, in turn creates for Russia a certain dependence on sea lines of communication. This is where perhaps they differ most from the old Soviet Union. They have a trade to GDP ratio of 43%, which is actually higher than that of the United States. So this is a nation that needs to be active on sea lines of communication in a way that its predecessor state did not. And then the third factor for them, of course, is the absolute centrality of the Arctic, of being able to be the dominant player, both in economic and military terms in that space. And so you see, even as the war has gone on, the Navy hasn't necessarily lost that. Its order of Yasen-class submarines, its newest class of SSGNs, which are comparable to Western submarines in quietness, not only did not drop during this conflict, but the schedule of deliveries was actually on time, which was not the case for the lead boat in class. And the Russian MOD indicated its intention to begin schedule of another batch of Yasen-class boats of equivalent in number, but in the 2030s, when the last boat in the first batch has been delivered. So, that's a significant investment. And this goes back when you look at, for example, Russia's last state armament program. The Navy actually had a larger share of it than the Army did. I don't think that'll necessarily be the case in this state armament program, but it does illustrate the importance they place on the Navy. A point on why I think the Russian Navy will continue to be a service which does not languish for want of investment is that to a great extent, a lot of Russia's precision strike capabilities, both in terms of conventional deep strike capabilities, but also dual use capabilities that can carry sub-strategic nuclear weapons. So things like the 3M14 caliber are held on naval platforms. Of course, Russia could rebalance its forces, but given that this has been the case for around 20 years now, the Russian Navy is sort of critical to any Russian effort to win a sort of a modern deep battle or a modern strike campaign by disrupting Allied air bases, for example, or by targeting critical infrastructure as they have in Ukraine. And the absolute importance that post-Cold War Russian military theorists have placed on precision strike capabilities for a variety of reasons means that the Navy, which I think quite cleverly got ahead in the game in Russia in terms of making itself one of the key sort of providers of deep strike, will structurally benefit from a certain amount of investment. So despite the fact that I think they will face real hard choices in terms of where they channel investment, I don't necessarily think the Russian Navy will languish. I think it will become a much more focused challenge because they've had much more success in building modern SSGNs, I should say, than they have in building larger surface combatants. So I think though it remains a challenge, it might become a much more two-dimensional challenge in terms of being a threat primarily in the subsurface domain, and to some extent in terms of the missile threats it can generate in Europe.
So that leads quite nicely then on to that's the threat. It does feel that the predominance seems to be focused on the subsurface. And when I first operated off Her Majesty's carriers, back in the 90s, they were adapting from this role of purely defending the fleet while it did anti-submarine warfare. We had the Nimrod doing all its work. We had a whole range, and there seemed to be a lot of expertise that we seem to have neglected a bit now. Is that an area you think where we need to focus our efforts and our equipment? And what capabilities do you think we need to polish off in order to create a credible deterrence for that Russian threat?
Well, so I think there's a few things. So in some ways, there's still quite a bit of expertise within the Royal Navy when it comes to ASW, particularly in terms of ASW, the ASW frigate force, and many allied navies still use us as a point with which to conduct their training and their workups. For example, the Royal Netherlands Navy being a case in point. But I think the major challenge we're going to look at is, firstly, in capability terms, our approach to ASW, and this is a Western problem rather than a Royal Navy problem, but it applies to us as well. Our approach to ASW just doesn't scale. For any single contact, one requires multiple assets to track it, including maritime patrol aircraft, frigates, and SSNs. And that just about works if you're tracking single contacts in in terms of peacetime competition. Once one is dealing with multiple contacts surging into a theater, the approach doesn't scale. It also doesn't scale it doesn't scale easily, irrespective of the circumstances. But I think it'll be especially problematic by the end of this decade, for a reason you alluded to, which is that in the Indo-Pacific, China will pose America a naval challenge of a kind it really hasn't faced in its 20th century history, namely that of a peer competitor which not just matches it, but actually exceeds it in terms of many areas like, shipbuilding capacity. And a lot of the capabilities most relevant to ASW, I'm thinking particularly, of things like maritime patrol aircraft like the P-8s, are American. The sonobuoys or sonobuoy stockpiles that are relevant to tracking submarine contacts are again, for the most part, American, particularly when one looks at the most modern variants like the multi-static acoustic coherent sonobuoys. And of course, SSNs that can operate in the high north are again a capability that will be in especially high demand, given that really there's two navies historically that have done it. It's the U.S. Navy and the Royal Navy. But the U.S. Navy will increasingly see its SSNs focused on the Indo-Pacific. Indo-PACOM already gets 60% of American SSNs in peacetime. But given the calculation the Americans have made that, in fact, because of the growing risks to their surface forces due to the very robust Chinese anti-access threat in the Pacific, subsurface competition remains one of their primary areas of enduring advantage over the Chinese. One would expect that sort of reallocation of capabilities to become even more or to accelerate under future administrations and to become even more acute in a conflict. So I think the big challenge we face is not so much the loss of skills, though that's a factor, but the fact that our approach to ASW just doesn't scale. So in terms of what capabilities one would need to deal with that, I think capabilities that can allow sort of individual assets to conduct surveillance over wider areas. And in particular, there's some fairly innovative work being done on the use of LFA sonar, low frequency active sonar in this space, might be the sorts of areas one would look to as well as, of course, uncrewed solutions as another way of widening the ASW net without trying to rely on more of the same.
Do you think, I mean, one of the questions we were chatting to a nuclear expert for one of our other episodes, and the CASD, Continuous At-Sea Deterrent, we're investing for the next 50 years. And one of the assumptions is that the water will remain opaque. It will not become transparent. The whole undersea world, do you think that's a credible assumption, given the rates of advances in technology? And we've already been hearing a lot about critical national infrastructure lying under the ocean. We're inevitably going to be spending more attention, keeping an eye on Russian, Chinese vessels, scoping out where our undersea capabilities are. I just wonder whether, eventually submarines, they're fantastic underwater because they can't be seen, run silent, run deep. But the moment the technology actually renders the water transparent rather than opaque, they become a bit of a liability. Do you think we're going to see that in the next 50 years?
I think it's conceivable, and we've seen in certain areas capabilities already being fielded on an experimental basis by navies such as China's PLA Navy, which fielded a quantum magnetometer on one of its maritime patrol aircraft, which significantly increases its range over what could be achieved by a traditional magnetic anomaly detector. There's obviously the idea that in the medium term, sort of quantum sensing could render the oceans increasingly transparent, and other modes of detection, things like uncrewed surface vessels, the use of non-acoustic modes of detection. Could also, increasingly hold submarines at risk. I would, however, say that although we've seen incremental improvements or the potential for incremental improvements in ASW capabilities using some of those disruptive technologies so far, things like the quantum magnetometer the Chinese have fielded. The sort of disruptive change that might render the oceans entirely transparent is still a somewhat more distant prospect, which relies on technologies that are still relatively nascent, although they could admittedly bear fruit in a 50-year time frame. The second question, I suppose, is one of what the theater of interest is. So, if we're looking at the European theater, the challenge posed by disruptive technologies, none of which Russia is necessarily at the leading edge of, is probably less acute than if you're, for example, the United States in the Indo-Pacific theater. So I guess it's a bit early to know whether these technologies will necessarily bear fruit. And there have been a lot of periods in naval history where a single technology was deemed to have rendered a certain type of capability obsolete only for it to bounce back. Like, the surface ship has had two deaths in the 20th century, right? First during the nuclear age, and then in the late 80s following the experiences of the Falklands War. And yet, it's as the old Mark Twain quote goes, rumors of my demise are greatly exaggerated. So, it's probably a bit early to draw broad conclusions based on what is potentially technologically feasible, both because we don't know whether the technology will meet its potential and be fielded on a scalable basis, and also because we don't know what the technological countermeasures which will emerge if and when it is fielded will be. But it's certainly a possibility to keep one's eye firmly on, considering what the ramifications would be for, as a CASD, as you rightly pointed out.
If I can pivot slightly to, we've got a new American president at the moment. Who knows what he'll actually end up doing? But he's been pretty clear that his focus is China, Europe. You need to step up, spend more money, and focus on Russia. There's also a question about America's role in NATO and where it's prepared to put resources. Now, if you're looking in the maritime domain, America has got significant maritime resources. But if those are not quite taken off the table, but no longer as readily available for a European conflict, and they are more earmarked for the Far East, it strikes me that a lot of European countries don't see themselves as maritime nations. For example, Poland is investing a lot in getting its army bigger, its tanks and air force. And therefore, it feels the danger is that people might look to the UK as filling in the maritime bits of that equation. Is the UK remotely big enough to do that? And I suppose it returns to the question of, it doesn't feel like we're equipped at the moment to do that role. That might require quite a capitalization, and it doesn't feel like there's a lot of money coming down the pipe. So are we ready to take on a greater role? And if we're not, how do we raise the awareness particularly in Europe, about the importance of the maritime domain?
Yeah, no, I think that's absolutely key because I don't think we're equipped to take on that role right now, not within Europe. In fact, I'm not sure even in secondary theaters we could, as currently constituted, backfill for American capabilities if they had been entirely pulled out. For example, the tempo of activity we've seen in the Red Sea would have quickly exhausted our stockpiles. The US Navy fired, I think, 80 Tomahawks in the early days of the conflict with the Houthis. I mean, in 2014, we bought 65 Tomahawks from the US. So, even in secondary theaters, I think we'd face really significant challenges in terms of magazine depth. To some extent, I don't think we could completely backfill the American role. We would have we would have to operate on an integrated basis with partners just because of the limitations in terms of, available numbers of platforms, for example. And so I think that would require us to perhaps think creatively about, for example, how we constitute a carrier strike group, to use one example of a unit of force, how we might draw partners into constituting one, and B, at a more technical level, what that might mean for, the practicalities like data links or sensitivities surrounding information, because that sort of thing is really difficult to achieve. Even, in American CSGs, for example, for a very long time, it was very difficult for partners to operate given the restrictions on, even basic networks like SIPRNet. So I think the ability, sort of creating the ability to interoperate with partners is going to be one major sort of line of effort, because we can add critical capabilities, but I don't think we can necessarily do so on a sovereign basis. The second area I think we probably will have to focus on is as you said, generating an awareness that the maritime domain, that even if Europe is, a land theater, the maritime domain still remains a critical component, and sort of underscoring the fact that the Russians do actually pay a lot of attention to the maritime domain. When one looks at what they write in their own military literature, they actually have very clear quantitative thresholds for what they deem an unacceptable level of risk that would basically doom a campaign to failure. And one, for example, was the idea that if 3 carrier strike groups were concentrated on their northwestern front, that would pose an unacceptable level of risk to them. Now, and they would have to take obviously a variety of steps to mitigate that risk. The point is, right now, Europe writ large theoretically could generate 3 carrier strike groups of a kind, for example, the Charles de Gaulle, the QEC, and to a certain extent, the Italian and Spanish capabilities, which sort of sit between the LHA and carrier strike sort of categories. But I'm not sure, that the planning as to how planning around exactly how that force would be generated without American support exists. And B, I don't think there's enough planning done, and perhaps there could be more planning done regarding, how capabilities that are currently quite federated can be integrated, because I don't think any one European state, well, I mean, just that one can say with certainty, no one European state could generate that sort of force on a sovereign basis. So I think, yeah, the Royal Navy can usefully play a part in backfilling for the Americans. It can't do so. It can't necessarily do so unilaterally. And really, in order to backfill collectively, there's going to have to be a lot more of integration of capability across Europe.
Siddharth, we talked a little bit about the carrier strike group. You mentioned that a couple of times. That isn't just about a carrier, obviously. There's a whole lot of cruisers, destroyers, there's an air wing, there's also subsurface, logistics, supply. There's a lot of things involved in that. The UK developed a carrier capability, the 2 Queen Elizabeth class, for a power projection capability. But you wonder these days, first of all, we've never managed to resource it properly, and whether actually that is what we need for the future. Where do you see the carriers fitting in to this sort of post Russian invasion, new world, more dangerous world order?
Yeah, I mean, it's an interesting question. I think there's a few ways in which the carriers can actually fit usefully into the UK's maritime approach in the maritime domain. So within Europe, I'd say they still remain probably one of the safer airfields for Allied fifth and particularly UK fifth gen air power. The Russians are fairly well aware that the best way to offset Allied air power is by destroying it on the ground with long range missiles. And while, there are a number of ways in which ground-based aircraft can be made more secure, dispersion and agile combat employment, there are some things like Alice terminals and mission programming computers that are just very hard to disperse and very hard to move. Now, the carriers, by contrast, have a relative margin of safety. The Russians have proven quite poor at dynamic targeting in the conflict in Ukraine. They struggled to sink Ukraine's last surface ship, the Yuri Oliferenko, for a very long time and eventually only sank it in port. They've also not properly replaced the old Soviet-era constellation of ELINT and radar satellites, Legenda and Rosat, with modern equivalents in large numbers. And so they would really struggle against dynamic targets. So while there is a margin of vulnerability when one's employing carrier-based air power, in the European theater, as contrasted with, say, the Indo-Pacific, where the Chinese have a much more robust maritime anti-access capability, I think that mobility, that maritime power projection, and in particular carrier strike provides, really do add a certain amount of value. Further afield, I'd say if one is compelled to conduct, for example, expeditionary activity or activity at reach, as we had to against the Houthis in the Red Sea more recently, there are always ground-basing options, but these options are often more politically fractious. Access can be denied, as happened, to use a slightly dated example, to the US with its bases in Turkey during the 2003 Iraq invasion. And the self-contained quality of carrier-enabled power projection does lend it a certain political utility and a certain strategic utility, even if militarily, from the strictly military standpoint, power can be projected from other sources, areas as well.
Yeah, so I mean, inevitably, having operated from Her Majesty's carriers many times in my career, I think it's a really interesting. We could do a whole program on that, but mindful of the time, I have to move on. A couple of shorter fire questions for you. We are living in an austere fiscal environment at the moment. What do you think are the key maritime capabilities that we need to keep onshore? I'm not necessarily talking about shipbuilding, but are there any particular elements of our maritime capability that are critical and therefore we need to maintain onshore?
Yeah, so I think in the short term, what's absolutely critical is our ASW capabilities. So that's ASW frigates, but also our ability to act offensively in the subsurface operating environment. So our SSNs. I think if there's one sort of subset of maritime capability that's sort of sine qua non in the European theater, assuming that is our priority, that's the critical one. In the medium term, I'd say the ability to build out a more full-fat carrier strike group, one that actually is self-sustaining, has enough escorts and enough magazine depth to operate independently, something that the CSG currently could not do, I think is a useful sort of target, both within the European theater and at reach in other theaters from which the US may increasingly also withdraw assets, the Middle East being an obvious example.
One of the generic things, I think, is a lot of time when you're operating at sea, you're out of sight, out of mind. And I'm not really sure that the British public is as aware of why the criticality of naval and maritime power. It's not just about maritime power and the open oceans. It's also the critical national infrastructure, whether it's gas pipelines, oil pipelines, intelligent lines. They appear to be becoming a lot more vulnerable. How do you see, and how do we combat that? Because our traditional Navy may not be well equipped to deal with this, given that there's a whole mass of these around the UK. There feels like we need an element of quantity as well as quality. How do you think the Navy would be best placed to tackle that threat?
Yeah, so I think there's a few things that navies can do in order to better tackle threats to critical infrastructure. The first, I think, is increasingly reaching beyond government because many of the most important and proliferated sensors in this area are actually held by the private sector. You know, when the Lov cable near Lofoten was cut in Norway, that country's navy had to turn to the oil and gas sector, which operates more UUVs than the navy does. Similarly, the Italian Navy has signed a deal with Italy's largest internet provider to leverage data from the sensors laid near its undersea cables. So, doing that sort of thing, but on a more systematic basis rather than in the form of ad hoc deals between individual national governments and individual private sector actors, I think is one way in which the breadth of data that's available beyond government could be more easily leveraged. But the second factor, I think, which will be of real concern for navies in peacetime is if you see an actor on the international waters and conducting what you think is sabotage, what can you actually do? Because it's not so much just a question of surveillance, it's what international law allows, which on international waters is actually not very much. Now, there is some creative work that can be done with the law here, because, for example, if you look at cables, the Convention on Undersea Telegraph Cables signed in 1890, to which Russia was and still is a signatory, actually does allow navies to board vessels on international waters if they deem them to be sabotaging undersea cables. And the US Navy has actually invoked that right at least once in the late 1950s. So there is precedent here. But I think legal departments will need to become a lot more sort of active in actually carving out more space for navies to operate on international waters rather than just constraining what they can do. Because in many ways, the challenge is it's partially a surveillance one, but it's partially a what are you going to do challenge. You know, one can posture, but unless one can interdict, there's actually limited value in surveillance.
It felt like with the Antar incident, it was almost like, although the Defence Secretary and House of Commons was being very robust, there were the questions, okay, what are you going to do about it? You know, Russia has invaded another country. There is grave suspicion about people interfering with our critical national infrastructure. So what do you do about it? A couple of things as well, just mindful that this is about more informing sort of defence review and options. You will have been watched with great interest, I've no doubt. In November last year, the government made some defence cuts, and the ones that hit the maritime world were HMS Albion and HMS Bulwark were brought out of service. The Type 23 frigates, HMS Northumberland was brought out, and also two tankers, RFA Wave Knight and Wave Ruler, were brought out. Do you think there's anything we should read into that? I know there was some debate that these were, frankly, it was might as well cut them off now because we were never going to use them. But it did feel that there was a subtext of this is the end of the expeditionary era, and this is we should be focused more on national defence.
It could be, but I guess another way of interpreting it is when you look at many of the capabilities that underpin concepts for expeditionary power projection in a contested anti-access environment. So, for example, most of the concepts which underpin the future commando force for the Marines, actually existing platforms like Albion and Bulwark were arguably very much out of kilter with those concepts anyway, which require, the surface connectors, which operate at much longer ranges, better defended amphibious platforms that can operate somewhat outside parts of the A2AD bubble, and so on. So I suppose there was a logic to say that might say not so much that expeditionary power projection is done or finished, but if our concepts for expeditionary power projection involve a, let's say, 10-year overhaul of how we do things, and if our approach is going to radically change in many ways, then holding on to legacy capabilities that are actually incompatible with what we say we need for expeditionary power projection, not just undercuts the Navy itself, but also in some ways prevents that sort of transformation that one needs in order to be more credible as a nation that may need to project power in contested and denied environments going forward. So I guess, one could interpret it as an investment in the future as well.
Yeah, I mean, again, it's another one we could talk forever about because there is a view that actually the government is really very constrained with finances, and that there's going to be some pretty brutal cuts potentially as a result of the defence review. And this was just potentially the sort of headlines making some early decisions, but you wouldn't make decisions like that unless you knew the direction of travel for defence. It felt like you did. My final question really is that you are an expert around the maritime domain, and you will therefore have a view. If you were king for the day, and we know we're in a fiscally limited environment, but for a maritime nation like the United Kingdom, where do you think the main priority should be for our nation in the maritime environment?
So I think the first and overriding priority is the old Cold War sort of focus on the North and on the high North. I think that has regained, and in many ways, the salience that it had in, say, the 1980s. Now, beyond that, there are challenges one may face, the Houthis in the Red Sea, for example, but we've seen that actually those challenges can be weathered. I mean, for all the disruption the Houthis caused to trade, it didn't necessarily change consumer inflation very much in Europe. These are challenges, but they are of a decidedly secondary nature. I'd say the one existential threat that, the UK faces very much comes from the east, and the maritime component of that threat is very much up in the high north. So that would be the area in which, were I king for a day, and it's sort of cognizant of, as you said, the fiscal limitations. That would be my first order of the day.
Well, it's been fascinating talking to you, and I would love to pursue this further, but we're always caught by time. Dr. Sidharth Kaushal, thank you so much indeed for your time today. I'm sure we'll be returning to this subject again, but a great privilege to have you on the show. Thank you.
Thank you very much for having me. It's been a pleasure.
Good.